The evening that changed everything. The hum of evening life echoed faintly through the quiet suburban streets. Commissioner James Reynolds, an esteemed figure known for his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement, sat in his office at the precinct. His wife, Claire Reynolds, was attending a gala downtown, a charity event she had spearheaded to raise funds for a cause close to her heart, providing scholarships to underprivileged children. The evening seemed uneventful until a call came through that would change their lives forever. Claire, dressed in a flowing blue gown that shimmered under the streetlights, drove her sleek black SUV home after a successful event. Her mind wandered to the smiling faces of donors and the hope she had helped ignite in the lives of the less fortunate. The city she lived in was often mired in stories of corruption and division, but tonight had reminded her of the good still present. As she turned onto her street, the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her brow furrowed. She hadn't been speeding, and her car's registration was in perfect order. Slowing to a halt, she glanced nervously in the mirror as two officers approached, their postures rigid and imposing. "Good evening, ma'am. License and registration, please," one officer said gruffly. Claire complied, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed over the documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer didn't respond immediately, instead stepping back to confer with his partner. Moments later, the first officer returned, his expression unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Confusion clouded her face. "Why? What's this about?" "Step out of the vehicle now," he repeated, his tone sharper. With no other option, Claire opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The officers directed her to face the vehicle, and one began to pat her down in full view of the street. Claire's voice rose, tinged with disbelief and frustration. "This is unnecessary. I haven't done anything wrong." "Ma'am, save it for the judge," one officer snapped, smirking slightly. As humiliation washed over her, Claire's eyes darted to a gathering group of bystanders. A few had their phones out, recording the unfolding scene. Her mind raced. What could possibly have warranted this? "You don't understand who I am," she said, her voice shaking with indignation. Before the officer could retort, the sound of screeching tires cut through the tension. A black sedan came to an abrupt halt, and James Reynolds stepped out, his suit still impeccably pressed despite the late hour. His face was a storm of controlled fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice like thunder. The officers froze, their hands still on their holsters. The commanding presence of the police commissioner was undeniable, and whispers rippled through the crowd. One officer stammered, "Sir, there was a report of a vehicle matching this description involved in a robbery earlier today." James's jaw tightened, "And your first instinct was to humiliate an innocent woman in public without evidence. Do you realize who she is? She's my wife." The weight of his words sent shockwaves through the small crowd. The officers exchanged panicked glances, the realization of their error sinking in. One finally managed to mutter, "Sir, we didn't know." "You didn't know?" James interrupted, his voice cold with restrained anger. "You didn't bother to verify before dragging her out of the car and subjecting her to this. This isn't just incompetence, it's disgraceful." Claire, shaken but defiant, stepped forward. "James, let it go. Let's just go home." But James wasn't finished. "No, Claire. This isn't just about you. This is about a system that allows this kind of behavior. There will be accountability for this." As James guided Claire to his car, one bystander spoke up, his voice carrying a mix of anger and resignation. "You think this is bad because it happened to her. This happens to people like us all the time, and nobody cares." James turned, locking eyes with the man. His words lingered, sharp and unyielding, piercing through the haze of anger that clouded the moment. For a brief second, James was silent, absorbing the raw truth in the man's statement. Back at home, the night was far from over. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, her elegant gown crumpled, the events replaying in her mind like a relentless reel. James paced the living room, his fury now tempered with contemplation. "This isn't just an isolated incident, Claire," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "That man was right. If this can happen to you, it can, and does, happen to others. This has to stop." Claire nodded, the fire of resolve igniting in her eyes. "Then let's do something about it. Together." James stopped pacing and looked at her. In her gaze, he saw the strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. She wasn't just the commissioner's wife. She was a force to be reckoned with in her own right. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the city skyline, James stood in his office, his mind racing. What had started as a personal affront had now become a mission. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with resistance, from within his own department and beyond. But for the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Across town, Claire sat at her desk, drafting a letter to the editor of the city's largest newspaper. The title, "When Justice Fails: My Ordeal and the Fight for Change." Neither of them could predict the battles that lay ahead, but one thing was clear: the fight for justice was just beginning. A system on trial. The morning after the ordeal, the city was abuzz. News of the incident involving Claire Reynolds, the wife of Police Commissioner James Reynolds, had spread like wildfire. Videos taken by bystanders were circulating online, showing the public search and confrontation with the officers. Social media platforms were ablaze with comments, debates, and outrage. Some condemned the officers' behavior, while others questioned the privilege associated with Claire's status. Yet one sentiment was shared universally. Something had gone terribly wrong, and accountability was overdue. James sat in his office, staring at the computer screen. He watched the video for the fourth time, each viewing stoking his anger and frustration. He paused the clip as the officer's smirk filled the screen. That smirk wasn't just a gesture of arrogance. It symbolized everything wrong with a system that protected power over justice. Claire entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one down on his desk, her gaze steady. "You're torturing yourself watching that." James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I have to. I need to understand how this happened, how my own officers could behave this way." Claire sat opposite him, her voice calm but firm. "It's not just about the officers, James. This is a symptom of something much bigger. You know that." He nodded. "I know, but fixing it means tearing down the very system I've been a part of for decades. That won't be easy." Claire's expression softened, but her resolve didn't waver. Nothing worth doing ever is. Later that day, James called a department-wide meeting. The precinct's conference room was packed, officers standing shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with unease. Everyone had heard about the incident, and rumors about the commissioner's reaction had spread quickly. James stood at the head of the room, his presence commanding. He let the silence linger, his gaze sweeping over the room, making sure every officer felt the weight of the moment. "Yesterday," he began, his voice steady but cold, "my wife, Claire Reynolds, was subjected to a public search and humiliation at the hands of this department. The officers involved acted without proper cause, without verification, and without respect for the dignity of another human being." A murmur rippled through the room, but James raised his hand, silencing it. "This is not just about Claire. This is about every single person who has experienced similar treatment at the hands of those sworn to serve and protect. This is about the trust we've broken with the public." Captain Ward, a senior officer known for his traditionalist views, cleared his throat. "Sir, with all due respect, mistakes happen. Are we really going to put the entire department under scrutiny for a single incident?" James turned his icy gaze to Ward. "This isn't a single incident, Captain. This is a pattern. And it's one I won't tolerate any longer." The tension in the room was palpable. Some officers looked uncomfortable, while others nodded subtly, their expressions grim. To address this, I'm launching a full investigation into department practices and procedures, James continued. Every complaint, every report of misconduct, past and present, will be reviewed. And let me be clear, anyone found guilty of abuse of power or neglect of duty will be held accountable. No exceptions. The room erupted into murmurs again, this time louder. Ward stood, his voice sharp. With respect, sir, this could destroy morale. Not every officer here is guilty of misconduct, and painting the entire department with the same brush. I'm not painting anyone with any brush, James interrupted, his tone unyielding. But if morale is shaken by accountability, then maybe it's time we ask ourselves why. The room fell silent again, and James continued. This department cannot stand if it's built on a foundation of corruption and fear. Change starts now. Meanwhile, Claire was busy waging her own battle. Her letter to the editor had gone viral, published on the front page of the city's leading newspaper under the headline, "A Broken System. My Ordeal and Why Change is Overdue." Her detailed account of the incident, combined with her impassioned plea for systemic reform, had sparked a wave of public discourse. In the days following its publication, Claire received countless messages of support from individuals who shared their own stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. One message stood out, a heartfelt email from a young woman named Elena Martinez. Elena wrote about her brother, Javier, who had been arrested a year ago for a crime he didn't commit. The officers who arrested him had used excessive force, and despite the family's attempts to file complaints, their voices had gone unheard. Javier had lost his job and struggled with the stigma of the false accusation. Claire read the email aloud to James that evening. When she finished, she looked at him, her eyes shining with determination. "This is why we have to do this, for people like Javier." James nodded, the weight of responsibility pressing on him. "We will, but it's going to get worse before it gets better." That prediction proved true. The backlash came swiftly. James's decision to launch the investigation was met with resistance, not just from within the department, but also from external forces. Local politicians, many of whom had ties to the police union, began criticizing his leadership. Media outlets ran stories questioning his motives, framing the investigation as a vendetta stemming from his wife's incident. One evening, as James prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text read, "You're making enemies, Commissioner. Back off while you still can." James showed the message to Claire, who frowned. "Do you think it's serious?" "It's a warning," James said grimly. "But if they think this will scare me off, they're wrong." The investigation moved forward, uncovering a disturbing pattern of misconduct. Several officers were found to have fabricated reports, used excessive force, or ignored protocol. Each revelation further divided the department. While some officers applauded James's efforts to clean house, others viewed it as a betrayal. The tension reached a boiling point when Captain Ward called for an emergency meeting with the police union, urging them to stand against James's reforms. In a fiery speech, he accused James of endangering the department's reputation and morale. Claire, aware of the growing opposition, took to the airwaves. Appearing on a popular local talk show, she spoke candidly about her experience and the need for reform. "This isn't about tearing down law enforcement," she said. "It's about rebuilding trust. The people of this city deserve a police force they can believe in, a force that operates with integrity and accountability." Her words resonated with the public, but they also painted a bigger target on her back. Anonymous threats began arriving in her inbox, each more menacing than the last. One night, as James and Claire sat in their living room, the sound of shattering glass startled them. James rushed to the front door, weapon in hand, to find a brick lying in the hallway, a note tied to it. The message was clear: "Stop now, or next time, it won't be a warning." James tightened his grip on the brick, his face a mask of controlled fury. Claire placed a hand on his arm, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We can't let them intimidate us." James nodded, his resolve hardening. They want us to back down because they know we're getting close. But we won't stop. The fight was far from over. But for James and Claire, the stakes had never been clearer or higher. Lines of division. The aftermath of the investigation's launch rippled through the city like an earthquake, exposing cracks in the bedrock of trust between the police force and the community they served. For Police Commissioner James Reynolds, those cracks threatened to widen into chasms. But instead of shying away, he faced them head-on, knowing that retreating would mean betraying his principles and those who had placed their faith in him. The morning after the brick incident, James stood in the precinct conference room, addressing his senior officers. Tension hung heavy in the air as he paced the room, his voice sharp and resolute. "We are sworn to uphold justice," James said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But justice doesn't just mean catching criminals. It means holding ourselves accountable when we fail. And right now, this department is failing." Captain Ward, who had been a vocal critic of James's reforms, crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "With respect, Commissioner, this investigation is tearing the department apart. Morale is at an all-time low. Officers feel like they're under siege." James stopped pacing and turned to face Ward directly. "Morale? You think this is about morale? Morale is a luxury we can afford once trust has been restored. Until then, we focus on cleaning up the mess we've allowed to fester." Ward's face reddened, but he held his tongue. James continued, "If any of you have doubts about what we're doing, you're free to walk out that door. But if you stay, you're committing to this reform, no matter how difficult it gets." A tense silence followed. No one moved. James took that as reluctant agreement, but he knew the battle within his own ranks was far from over. Meanwhile, Claire had her own battles to fight. Her letter and subsequent media appearances had galvanized public opinion, sparking protests across the city. Some were peaceful, with citizens demanding police accountability and justice for past victims of misconduct. Others, however, turned violent, with clashes erupting between protesters and officers. Claire found herself at the center of this storm. Every step she took outside the house felt like walking a tightrope. Supporters approached her with heartfelt thanks, while detractors hurled insults and accusations. At a grocery store one afternoon, a man confronted her in the parking lot. "You think you're a hero," he sneered. "All you're doing is making things worse. My brother's a cop, and now he's afraid to do his job because of people like you." Claire squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. "If your brother is a good cop, he has nothing to fear. This isn't about targeting officers. It's about holding the bad ones accountable." The man glared at her but said nothing further, storming off in frustration. Claire watched him go, her heart pounding. She wasn't afraid for herself, but for James. She knew the deeper they dug, the more enemies they would make. As tensions mounted, a break in the investigation provided a glimmer of hope. Detective Erica Lawson, a dedicated and relentless officer, had uncovered a trove of evidence linking several senior officers to falsified reports and unreported incidents of excessive force. The evidence was damning: emails, surveillance footage, and whistleblower testimonies that painted a clear picture of systemic misconduct. When Erica presented the findings to James, his initial reaction was a mix of anger and sadness. "Some of these names," he said, scanning the list. "These are officers I've worked with for years. People I trusted." Erica nodded solemnly. "I know it's hard, sir. But if we don't act on this, we're complicit." James nodded, his resolve hardening. "We'll proceed, but we'll do it by the book. No shortcuts." The next morning, James announced a series of suspensions and internal hearings. The move sent shockwaves through the department, further deepening the divide between those who supported the reforms and those who resisted them. Captain Ward was among the most vocal critics, holding an impromptu meeting with like-minded officers to rally opposition against James. "It's not just about the investigation," Ward said, his voice rising with frustration. "This is about loyalty. The commissioner has turned his back on us. He's hanging good officers out to dry to protect his reputation." One of the officers, a younger man named Officer Grant, hesitated. But what if he's right? What if some of the guys he's suspending really are guilty? Ward shot him a glare. "Are you questioning the integrity of your fellow officers? Because if you are, you're no better than him." Grant fell silent, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Not everyone in the department shared Ward's view, and cracks were beginning to form in his coalition. While the department wrestled with its internal strife, James and Claire received an unexpected visitor at their home one evening. Belina Martinez, the young woman who had written to Claire about her brother, arrived unannounced, clutching a folder of documents. "I'm sorry to bother you," Belina said, her voice trembling, "but I didn't know where else to go. After your letter, I felt like maybe someone would finally listen." James invited her in, and Alina explained her situation in detail. The documents she brought included medical reports from her brother's injuries during his arrest, as well as correspondence with the department's Internal Affairs Division, letters that had gone unanswered. "This is why people don't trust the police," Alina said, her eyes brimming with tears. "We tried to follow the system, and it failed us." James leafed through the documents, his jaw tightening. "I promise you, we'll look into this. Your brother's story deserves justice." The following week, a public hearing was held to address the growing unrest. Community leaders, activists, and citizens packed the city council chamber, while a line of uniformed officers stood at the back, their expressions a mix of defiance and resignation. James took the podium, his presence commanding but measured. He began by acknowledging the pain and mistrust that had brought them to this point. "This is not an easy conversation," he said, "and it's not a problem we can solve overnight, but we must confront it head-on. The events of the past weeks have made it clear that change is not optional, it's necessary." The room erupted into applause from the crowd, but boos and jeers echoed from the back where the officers stood. One officer shouted, "You're betraying us, Commissioner." James paused, turning to face the dissenting voices. "I'm not betraying anyone. I'm standing up for what's right. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem." After the hearing, James and Claire drove home in silence, the weight of the day pressing down on them. As they pulled into their driveway, a familiar black sedan was parked nearby. James's instincts went on high alert, but as they approached, Detective Erica Lawson stepped out. "Commissioner," Erica said, her tone urgent, "we've got a problem. Someone's been leaking information about the investigation to the press. They're spinning it to make you look like the bad guy." James clenched his fists. "Do we know who's behind it?" Erica hesitated. "Not yet, but I have a lead. It might tie back to Captain Ward." James nodded. "Do what you have to, but be careful. If he's involved, he won't go down quietly." That night, as James and Claire prepared for bed, James's phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "You think you're winning. We're just getting started." James showed it to Claire, who sighed heavily. "They're trying to wear you down." "They won't succeed," James said firmly, "but they're making their next move, and we need to be ready." As they turned off the lights, neither of them could shake the feeling that the storm was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. The storm breaks. The tension in the city was palpable, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. News outlets buzzed with updates about the ongoing investigation into police misconduct, each report casting Commissioner James Reynolds in a different light. To his supporters, he was a reformer standing up to corruption. To his detractors, he was a traitor tearing the department apart. And to those caught in the crossfire, he was a symbol of the deep fractures within the system. For James, the weight of the conflict was unrelenting. Every decision he made felt like walking a razor's edge. But he was determined not to falter, not when so much was at stake. At the precinct, Detective Erica Lawson sat in her dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of files and her ever-present laptop. She had spent days unraveling the threads of corruption that tied Captain Ward and his allies to a web of illicit activities. But every time she got close to a breakthrough, the trail went cold, as though someone were always one step ahead. That morning, as she sifted through a fresh batch of financial records, her phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from an anonymous source. Look closer at Ward's campaign donors. The answers you seek are there. Erica's brow furrowed. Campaign donors. Ward had been considering a run for city council, but his candidacy was unofficial. How could donors factor into this? Intrigued, she began digging. Within hours, she discovered something alarming. Several donors listed under Ward's exploratory campaign were shell corporations tied to Councilman Victor Lawton, a powerful political figure with a reputation for ruthlessness. Lawton had been vocal about his opposition to James's reforms, framing them as an overreach that endangered public safety. Erica leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If Ward and Lawton were connected, it meant the resistance James was facing wasn't just internal, it was political. She immediately called James, who was at home reviewing the latest updates on the investigation. When he answered, Erica's voice was sharp with urgency. "Commissioner, we have a problem. Captain Ward is tied to Lawton. The shell corporations funding his campaign all lead back to the councilman." James felt his stomach knot. That explains a lot. Lawton's been a thorn in my side for months. He's been rallying public opinion against the reforms. But this means he's directly involved in trying to sabotage us. "There's more," Erica said grimly. "I cross-referenced the donors with financial transactions flagged by Internal Affairs last year. Some of those funds are linked to payouts made to officers accused of misconduct. It looks like hush money." James's grip on the phone tightened. This isn't just corruption. It's a conspiracy. While James processed this revelation, Claire was meeting with Elena Martinez. The young woman had been relentless in advocating for her brother, Javier, whose case had become a rallying cry for reform. Together, Claire and Elena had been organizing a public forum where victims of police misconduct could share their stories. The forum was scheduled for that evening at a community center, and despite threats and opposition, Claire was determined to see it through. As they finalized the event details, Elena turned to Claire, her voice hesitant. "Do you ever feel scared? Like they'll come after you?" Claire paused, meeting Elena's gaze. "Every day. But fear can't stop us. If we let it, they win. And we've already come too far to back down." Elena nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right. We have to keep fighting." That evening, the community center was packed. People from all walks of life had gathered to hear the stories of those who had suffered under a broken system. Claire stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding but warm. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady. "This isn't just about me or my family. This is about every person who has been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. Tonight, we give them a voice." One by one, individuals stepped forward to share their experiences. A young mother recounted how her son had been wrongfully arrested and detained for weeks. An elderly man spoke of being assaulted during a routine traffic stop. Elena shared Javier's story, her voice trembling with emotion. As the evening wore on, the weight of the stories filled the room. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. But the mood wasn't just somber, it was electric. For the first time, people felt like change was possible. However, not everyone welcomed the forum's message. Outside, a group of protesters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Support our police," and "Reynolds must go." Their chants grew louder as the event went on, creating a tense atmosphere. When Claire stepped outside after the forum, she was immediately surrounded by reporters. Questions flew at her from every direction. "Mrs. Reynolds, do you think your husband's investigation is hurting the police department? What do you say to critics who accuse you of using your platform for personal gain? Do you believe the commissioner will survive the political backlash?" Claire raised a hand, silencing the reporters. "This isn't about politics. It's about justice, And if speaking out makes me a target, so be it. But I won't stop fighting for what's right. Back at the precinct, James was preparing to confront Captain Ward. Armed with the evidence Erica had uncovered, he knew it was time to force Ward's hand. But as he reviewed his strategy, Erica burst into his office, her expression alarmed. "We've got a leak," she said, dropping a file on his desk. "Someone's feeding information about the investigation to Lawton. Every move we make, they know about it." James felt a surge of frustration. "Do we know who?" Erica hesitated. "Not yet, but it has to be someone close to you." The realization hit James like a punch to the gut. Trust was a rare commodity these days, and the idea that someone in his inner circle might be working against him was almost too much to bear. As James and Erica strategized, events were unfolding outside their control. Captain Ward, aware that the walls were closing in, held a secret meeting with Councilman Lawton at a private club downtown. "This investigation has gone on long enough," Ward said, his voice low but furious. "Reynolds is making it impossible for me to do my job." Lawton smirked, swirling his glass of whiskey. "Reynolds is a problem, but he's also an opportunity. If we play this right, we can turn public opinion completely against him." "How?" Ward asked, his tone skeptical. "Simple," Lawton replied. "We leak the right story to the press. Make it look like Reynolds' investigation is motivated by personal vendettas, not justice. And if that doesn't work, we apply more pressure." Ward's expression darkened. "Pressure how?" Lawton's smirk widened. "Leave that to me." That night, as James drove home, his phone buzzed with a message from Erica. "I found the leak. Meet me at the precinct. It's urgent." James turned the car around, his pulse quickening. When he arrived, Erica was waiting in the parking lot, holding a USB drive. "It's Ward," she said without preamble. "He's been feeding information to Lawton and trying to discredit the investigation from the inside." James's jaw tightened. Then it's time to bring him in. But before they could act, James's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video sent from an anonymous number. He opened it, and his heart sank. The video showed Claire at the community forum, her impassioned speech taken out of context and spliced with footage of violent protests. The caption read, "Commissioner's wife stirs division in the city." James's hands clenched into fists. They weren't just targeting him anymore. They were going after Claire. "This is war," he muttered. Erica nodded. "And we need to make our next move count." As James prepared to confront Ward, he knew the fight was no longer just about reforming the department. It was about protecting the people he loved and exposing the powerful forces determined to destroy him. The storm had broken, and the battle ahead would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The depths of betrayal. The next morning, the city woke to chaos. News stations ran the doctored footage of Claire Reynolds at the community forum, framing her as a divisive figure inciting unrest. Headlines screamed accusations of hypocrisy and corruption against Commissioner James Reynolds, claiming his investigation was nothing more than a power grab. Inside their home, James and Claire sat together at the kitchen table. The light streaming through the window seemed mocking, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled over their lives. Claire stared at her phone, scrolling through a relentless stream of hateful comments. Her voice was steady but laced with fatigue. "They're turning everything we've done into a weapon against us." James reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "They're desperate, Claire. This means we're getting close." Her gaze met his fiery determination, returning to her eyes. "Then we don't stop. Not now." At the precinct, James walked into his office with a singular focus: to take down Captain Ward. The evidence Erica Lawson had uncovered was damning, and James knew it was only a matter of time before Ward's connections to Councilman Lawton unraveled completely. But as he prepared to summon Ward, Erica burst into his office, her face pale. "Commissioner," she said, shutting the door behind her, "we've got a bigger problem." James frowned. "What now?" Erica handed him a file. It's not just Ward and Lawton. I found something deeper. Financial transactions linking Lawton to private security firms. He's been funneling money to these companies for months, and they're preparing to take over law enforcement in key areas of the city. James flipped through the file, his jaw tightening. Privatization. Lawton's been angling for this for years. Erica nodded. And it's worse than that. These firms aren't just providing security. They're arming themselves with military-grade weapons. If Lawton's plan goes through, the city will be under the control of private enforcers loyal only to him. James leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. This isn't just about corruption. It's a hostile takeover. As James and Erica strategized their next move, Claire was meeting with Elena Martinez. The young woman had been instrumental in rallying community support, but she was also increasingly worried about the threats Claire and James faced. You're risking everything, Elena said, her voice heavy with concern. Are you sure it's worth it? Claire smiled faintly. If we don't fight now, when will we? People like Lawton thrive on fear. They count on us giving up, but we're not going to. Elena nodded, emboldened by Claire's resolve. Then let's keep fighting. Together, they worked to organize a press conference where victims of police misconduct would share their stories directly with the media. It was a bold move, but Claire believed the power of their voices would outweigh the smear campaign against her and James. At the same time, James confronted Captain Ward in the precinct's conference room. The air was charged as the two men faced each other, the weight of their history hanging between them. Captain Ward, James began, his voice cold, you've been working against this department and this city. I have evidence linking you to Councilman Lawton's shell corporations, as well as the payouts to cover up misconduct. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Ward's expression didn't waver. I have nothing to say to a man who's destroyed this department from the inside. James stepped closer, his tone sharp. You think you're a martyr, Ward? You're not. You're a coward, hiding behind politics and corruption while pretending to care about your officers. Ward smirked. You're so blinded by your crusade, you don't even see what you're doing. You're alienating the very people who could have been your allies. James shook his head. You're wrong. The people I've alienated are the ones who never cared about justice in the first place. You included. He gestured toward the door, where two internal affairs officers waited. Captain Ward, you're under investigation for conspiracy, corruption, and obstruction of justice. Turn in your badge and gun. Ward's smirk faltered, but he complied, his face a mask of simmering rage. As the officers escorted him away, he turned to James. You think you've won. Lawton won't go down as easily as I have. James watched him leave, his jaw set. We'll see about that. That evening, the press conference organized by Claire and Elena was held at a local park. A podium stood under a canopy of lights, surrounded by rows of folding chairs. Dozens of people attended, some carrying signs that read "Justice for All" and "Accountability Now." Cameras from local news outlets were stationed in the back, their lenses trained on the speakers. Claire stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began. We're here to share stories that have too often been ignored, stories that reveal the cracks in a system meant to protect us. One by one, individuals came forward to speak. A young black man recounted how he had been profiled and harassed by officers for simply walking home at night. A mother described how her teenage daughter had been injured during a wrongful arrest. Each story added to the growing chorus of pain and frustration, but also of hope and resilience. As the final speaker finished, Claire returned to the podium. These stories matter, she said, her voice strong. They remind us that change is not just possible, it's necessary. And for those who stand in the way of that change, know this: we will not be silenced. The crowd erupted into applause, but the moment was interrupted by a commotion at the back. A group of men in dark suits pushed their way through, their faces grim. At their center was Councilman Lawton. "This is enough," Lawton declared, his voice booming. "You've turned this city into a circus, all to push your own agenda." Claire met his gaze, unflinching. "The only agenda here is justice." Lawton smirked. "Justice or revenge? Your husband's investigation is tearing this city apart, and you're only making it worse." Before Claire could respond, a figure emerged from the crowd. It was Elena, holding a microphone. "No," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "You're the one tearing this city apart. You and people like you, who think power means you're above the law." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Lawton's smirk faltered. He turned and stormed off, his entourage following. Back at the precinct, James received an urgent call from Erica. "Commissioner, we've got a lead on Lawton's private security deal. It's happening tonight at the old shipping yard." James's pulse quickened. "Do we have backup?" "Not yet," Erica admitted. "But we can't wait. If we don't intercept this deal, he'll get away with everything." James didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." At the shipping yard, James and Erica moved through the shadows, their weapons drawn. The sprawling yard was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery. In the center of the yard, a group of men were gathered around a stack of crates. Among them was Lawton. James signaled for Erica to flank left as he moved closer. He could hear snippets of conversation, discussions of contracts, shipments, and payouts. It was the evidence they needed. But as James raised his phone to record, a flashlight beam caught him. "Hey!" one of the men shouted. Chaos erupted as Lawton's men drew their weapons. James dove for cover, returning fire as Erica joined the fray. The exchange was intense, but James's focus was unyielding. He moved toward Lawton, who was attempting to flee. "Stop!" James shouted, his voice echoing through the yard. Lawton turned, his face twisted in fury. "You think you've won, Reynolds. You have no idea what you're up against." James closed the distance between them, his weapon steady. "Maybe not, but I know one thing. You're done." As police sirens filled the air, Lawton surrendered, his smirk replaced by a scowl. James watched as officers cuffed him, a sense of relief washing over him. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The fight to dismantle Lawton's empire, and the system that allowed it to thrive, was far from over. The battle for redemption. The following morning, news of Councilman Victor Lawton's arrest dominated every media outlet. Headlines declared a major victory for Commissioner James Reynolds, but James himself felt no triumph. He knew the battle was far from over. Lawton's arrest was a critical blow to the conspiracy, but the systemic corruption that had allowed men like Lawton to thrive was still intact. As James arrived at the precinct, he was greeted with a mix of respect and resentment. Some officers nodded in approval, while others avoided his gaze, their loyalty still torn. The division within his department was now undeniable, and James knew he needed to address it head-on. A department divided. Later that day, James called a meeting with every officer in the precinct. The room buzzed with tension as the officers gathered, some skeptical, others curious. James stood at the front, his posture straight, his expression resolute. "Yesterday, we arrested Councilman Victor Lawton," he began, his voice echoing through the room. That arrest wasn't just about taking down one man. It was about sending a message to him, to his allies, and to anyone who thinks they can exploit this city for their own gain. He paused, scanning the room. "But I'm not naive. I know this department is divided. I know some of you feel betrayed by the changes we're making. But let me make this clear. These changes are not optional. If we want to rebuild trust with the people we serve, we have to start by holding ourselves accountable." Captain Ord's empty chair was a stark reminder of the sacrifices being made. James continued, his tone softening. "I understand the frustration. I understand the fear of change. But if you're here, if you wear this badge, you've made a commitment to serve and protect. And that commitment starts now." For a moment, the room was silent. Then one officer stood. It was Officer Grant, the young man who had previously hesitated to question Ward's leadership. "Commissioner," Grant said, his voice steady, "I've had my doubts about all this, but seeing what happened with Lawton, I get it now. I'm in." A ripple of agreement spread through the room as other officers nodded, though the entire room didn't shift at once. James saw the tide beginning to turn. Claire's counteroffensive. Meanwhile, Claire Reynolds was waging her own battle in the public sphere. The edited footage of her at the community forum continued to circulate, and though many people supported her, others had taken the bait, branding her a troublemaker. Claire decided to respond directly. She contacted a prominent journalist known for hard-hitting interviews and arranged a live sit-down. That evening, millions of viewers tuned in as Claire faced the journalist across a sleek news desk. The journalist didn't hold back. "Mrs. Reynolds," she began, "critics say you're using your platform to divide the city. How do you respond to that?" Claire met the journalist's gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Division already existed in this city long before I spoke out. The difference now is that people are finally paying attention to it. If highlighting injustice makes people uncomfortable, then maybe it's time we re-examine what we're comfortable with." The journalist pressed on. "But what do you say to those who claim your husband's investigation is tearing the police department apart?" Claire didn't flinch. "I say it's exposing the cracks that were already there. You can't fix a broken system by ignoring its flaws. James isn't tearing the department apart. He's trying to rebuild it into something stronger." Her words resonated deeply, and by the end of the interview, social media was flooded with messages of support. The tide of public opinion began to shift once more. A new threat emerges. While Claire worked to sway the public, James and Erica Lawson were focused on the next steps in the investigation. With Lawton in custody, they now had access to his records, which revealed shocking new details. The private security firms Lawton had been funding were part of a larger nationwide network with ties to organized crime. The implications were staggering. Lawton was just a middleman, Erica said as she sifted through the documents. These security firms are connected to companies operating in other major cities. This isn't just about privatizing police forces. It's about creating a shadow network of control. James rubbed his temples, the enormity of the situation sinking in. If this goes public, it'll shake the entire country. Before they could act, however, James's phone buzzed with an anonymous text. "You've gone too far. Back off, or you'll regret it." James showed the message to Erica, his jaw tightening. "They're scared. That means we're on the right track." The final confrontation. The next evening, James received a call from one of his trusted officers. "Commissioner, we got a tip about a meeting between Lawton's associates. It's happening tonight at an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city." James knew it was a risk, but he also knew they couldn't let this opportunity slip away. He gathered a team of his most loyal officers and coordinated with Erica to lead the operation. As they approached the factory under cover of darkness, James's heart pounded. This wasn't just about gathering evidence. This was about sending a message that corruption would no longer be tolerated. Inside the factory, the meeting was already underway. Several men stood around a table laden with documents and briefcases. James recognized some of them as executives from the private security firms tied to Lawton. James and his team moved quickly, bursting into the room with weapons drawn. "This is the police. Hands where we can see them." Chaos erupted as the men scrambled to escape. James tackled one of the executives as Erica chased another through the factory. Within minutes, the team had detained everyone present. Among the items confiscated were detailed plans for expanding the private security network, along with lists of officials who had been bribed to support the initiative. The evidence was undeniable. A city transformed. In the weeks that followed, the arrests of Lawton's associates and the exposure of their plans sent shockwaves through the city and beyond. Media outlets hailed James Reynolds as a hero, though he remained humble, emphasizing that the fight for justice was far from over. At the precinct, the atmosphere began to shift. Officers who had once doubted James's reforms now saw their value. Morale improved as trust between the department and the community slowly started to rebuild. Claire continued her advocacy work, using her platform to push for broader reforms beyond the police department. Together, she and James became symbols of resilience and accountability. The road ahead. One evening, as James and Claire sat together on their porch, the city skyline glowing in the distance, Claire turned to him. "Do you think it's over?" James shook his head. "No, this was just one battle. But it's a start." Claire smiled, taking his hand. "Then we'll keep fighting. Together." As the night settled around them, the city seemed quieter, its wounds beginning to heal. And though the road ahead was uncertain, James and Claire knew they had taken the first steps toward true change. A change that would ripple far beyond their city, inspiring others to stand up for justice, no matter the cost.